The storm came in quiet over the black water and laid itself across the town until every roof and road wore the same white weight that makes a chest feel small. All night, the wind held one low note and pressed the snow into clean shapes that hid door seams and softened window corners. People stayed inside because voices went thin and broke, and because the cold told the body to save air, not spend it. At dawn, the sky cleared to a hard blue that cut the eyes. The air stung the nose and tightened the chest before anyone stepped outside. Neighbors opened doors and shoveled paths that closed again as soon as the shovel lifted. The sea kept its distance today. The road to St. Mary's showed itself in a narrow strip of ice along the north wall where the wind had scoured it clean. The front steps were strangely clear, as if swept by a careful hand before the storm thickened. The handle burned cold through a glove. Inside the hall, the air was warm in the heavy way of a room kept even for too long. A clock in the office kept a calm rhythm that did not match the sea. The quiet was not the hush after panic. It was the weight of a rule. The dormitory doors stood open. 2 lines of iron beds, 15 in all, lay made to a smooth flatness that looked like a lesson. Under each frame, boots sat toe to heel with laces tucked inside and leather brushed clean of salt. Names were not on the bed frames, only small chalk moons above them on the wall. On the windows, frost had grown in white ferns. Behind the frost, the latches were visible and shut. Pillows showed shallow hollows that had been smoothed by a steady hand. In the washroom, a line of cups stood upside down on a towel, each rim dry. In the kitchen, the bread box stood open to a heel. The chapel held a mild heat that did not belong to morning. Someone had knelt there not long before. The rail was faintly warm to the touch. There were no coats on hooks and no scarves left in a pile for a rush into weather. Where a person would expect the mess that follows fear, there was order that looked like care and did not care at all. People spread through the rooms and then out into the yard. They checked the roof for a slide, the coal chute for a crawl space, the laundry shed for a hidden drop. Snow lay hard on top and hollow below, so each step broke the crust and sent a dull sound into the ground. They listened for a cry and found only wind pulling grains of ice like a second tide. There were no tracks, not even the shallow marks of a small heel by a door stone. Inside again, a hand on the stair rail felt a faint hum, not the boiler and not the clock. It was the kind a house learns when a pattern repeats for months. The beat seemed kind at first and then too even, like a measure that did not care who kept it. Order sat in every room as if placed there and then polished. People used words like hidden and slipped and waiting because the mouth resists gone when beds are this neat, and boots this exact. Down by the north wall, where the wind had scraped the snow to glass, something dark lay under the clear skin. It was a small mitten pressed flat, the wool splayed into the frost, and the thumb folded toward the palm. A person could hold a hand above it and feel nothing, and still the eye would not move away. The mitten faced the house. Beyond it, the strip of ice ran to the door in a straight line with no step beside it. The house looked back with even windows and shut latches and a clock that kept its calm beat. It had smiled at visitors only yesterday, and would do so again when people returned to tell themselves a fair story about care. The halls of St. Mary's looked almost proud the day the donors came. The storm was still far off, just a gray bruise on the edge of the sky, and inside the home everything gleamed with a polish that carried no dust and no smell of labor. Floors shone under shoes, iron beds glinted with brass knobs, and curtains hung straight without a crease out of place. The children gathered in the chapel, standing in even rows with their hands folded at their waists, their lips parting as one when the song began. The voices were steady, Not high or low, not eager or shy. Each word rose with the same length of breath, held as if counted. The sound was pleasant at first, even beautiful, until a person noticed there was no rise of excitement, no wavering laugh in the back row, no single child drifting out of tune. It was the kind of song that felt memorized into the body, not sung from it. Donors smiled at the discipline. They spoke of how rare it was to see so many orphans so well kept, so obedient, so calm. The matron, Lucia Caro, stood with warm hands folded at her waist, nodding with a look of pride that passed for love. She reminded them that peace was the greatest gift for children, and that peace required order. Her voice never rose, not even when a small cough tried to break the rhythm of the song. The child who coughed was quickly guided to the back, her steps careful, her eyes down. The donors barely noticed her leave. In the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread carried out on steam as Mrs. Bridget O'Rourke lifted loaves from the oven. She beamed at the visitors and offered slices with butter that melted before it touched the tongue. A few donors whispered that it tasted sweeter than any bread they had at home. Bridget chuckled and said it was only good milk and patience, but she did not say more. Behind her, rows of bowls waited, stacked exact, every rim wiped dry. A pot of broth simmered with no meat, no roots, only a thin sheen of fat, yet the room felt heavy with warmth. Donors praised her skill, unaware that every flavor here was carefully measured to teach a lesson of calmness, of obedience hidden even in taste. Downstairs, a narrow corridor led toward the laundry where steam clung to the stone walls. Here the air felt thick, and here the visitors' laughter fell quieter. A young laundress, May Brennan, bent over a washboard with red hands and lowered eyes. Her shoulders stiffened when one of the men asked why a door at the far wall was always kept shut. The paint around the lock was new, brighter than the rest, and the handle gleamed from polishing. May opened her mouth but said nothing. Lucia stepped in quickly, smiling, her tone so smooth it felt like an embrace. She explained that the basement beyond was too cold for visitors, that drafts from the coast made it unsafe for children to wander, and that only the staff went down there to store coal. She moved the group along before another question could catch. May's gaze dropped again, her lips pale from holding back words. When she lifted a basket, her hands trembled enough for one damp rag to slip and strike the floor with a sound that lingered longer than cloth should. The donors left the home in high spirits. They clapped Lucia on the shoulder and praised her for giving children more than shelter, for giving them discipline and dignity. They promised more funds, more support, more visits, each convinced they had seen something rare and noble. As their carriages rolled away, the first shiver of wind pulled across the water. Snow clouds gathered thick at the horizon, bending light into a gray curtain that swallowed the coast. The home stood in its perfect order, its walls clean, its windows glowing faintly in the dim afternoon. Behind those windows, the children returned to their rows, their breaths measured, their voices held on an invisible count. Outside, the storm inched closer, as if it had been summoned to test the silence that lived within those walls. Matron Lucia Caro carried herself like a woman who had never once raised her voice. Her presence filled a room not with command but with the soft weight of expectation, the kind that bent spines without a word. She wore gloves when she greeted donors and townspeople, pale fabric that seemed almost ceremonial. But in the children's quarters she removed them. Her bare hands, always warm, always steady, rested on small shoulders, brushed across cheeks, or lingered against thin ribs as if to feel the rhythm beneath. To the outside world, this touch looked like kindness, proof of her role as a mother to the unwanted. Yet the children learned early that warmth was not love but a measure, and that a still chest was praised far more than a beating heart that raced. On her desk lay a book that never held names. Its pages were ruled with clean columns, each mark drawn in chalk as white as bone. A circle meant a night passed without sound. A smudge meant restlessness. A faint slash meant a cough or whisper. Children disappeared from the ledger not because they left, but because their marks became too many, their breaths too loud. To visitors, Lucia explained the book as a record of chores and hymns. To herself, it was the true weight of her work, a record not of lives lived, but of silence kept. She believed quiet was proof of care. The louder the world outside, the more she closed her children into stillness, teaching them that movement wasted strength and sound wasted air. In the evenings, when the chapel lamps dimmed, she gathered them for what she called stillness lessons. The children lay flat under thin blankets while Lucia walked among the beds, her hand gliding from chest to chest. If the rise was even and shallow, she smiled and whispered that peace had found them. If the rise was quick, if a throat rasped or a sigh escaped, her hand pressed more firmly until the body beneath learned to slow. She told them that calm lungs were holy lungs, that the Lord himself loved breath held in waiting more than words spilled into the air. From a distance it looked like mercy. Her touch tender, her voice soothing, her figure drifting like a mother's shadow through the room. Up close it was rule, a lesson written into bone and blood. Children came to believe that the silence in their bodies pleased her more than any prayer. They learned to count heartbeats, to lie as if asleep even when terror kept them awake, to measure each breath so it did not break the air. Those who succeeded earned a white circle in her book, a mark that meant survival for another day. Those who faltered carried the weight of her warm hand until their lungs obeyed. And so the home glowed with order and calm, a place where visitors saw peace and comfort. But beneath that calm was a fear so deep it could not speak, a fear trained into small lungs that learned quiet was the only proof of being cared for. And the storm that gathered beyond the coast would not be the first to test that rule, only the loudest. Father Malachi Duval arrived on a gray morning with the sea at his back and a case in his hand that clicked with the sound of glass shifting inside. His hair was white, though his face was not old, and his eyes held the steady calm of a man who believed in patterns more than mercy. He bowed low to Matron Lucia Caro, calling her work a miracle, and then laid his case open on the chapel table as if he were setting out holy relics. Inside were glass tubes, thin reeds stained faintly at the tips, and 3 brass metronomes polished to a mirror shine. He called them tools for prayer, but the children soon learned they were tools for measuring how long a body could stay quiet before the panic rose. He told the children that breath was the purest hymn, that words distracted but silence shaped by rhythm pleased God most. One by one he placed reeds between their lips and told them to hum with the metronome's tick. The reeds burned the tongue with a bitter tang, a taste of metal and oil, while the metronome kept its cruel, steady pace. Each child had to match it to stretch the hum across the seconds until their lungs begged for air. If they broke too soon, if the hum faltered, a small silver bell on his desk rang with a quick strike of his hand. The sound was sharp enough to cut through the still chapel, and with it came a look from Lucia that told the child they had failed in their duty of silence. Malachi's lessons grew harsher as the weeks passed. He timed their breathing with sand through narrow tubes, watching the grains fall while the children clenched their jaws and fought against the need to gasp. He praised the ones who turned purple without sound, who learned to hold panic down as if it were sin itself. To him, a child who cried out was a soul unfit for grace, but one who surrendered to stillness was ready for salvation. He said that each second of breath held was a bead on a rosary, a prayer without words that made heaven lean closer. Children began to fear the bell more than the burn in their lungs. At night they lay flat in their beds, practicing in the dark, counting heartbeats, clenching fists until their chests ached. They whispered to each other that maybe if they could master the count, if they could become like the ones who never made the bell ring, then the warm hand of the matron would rest on them with approval instead of weight. What began as terror turned into a strange kind of pride, a competition of silence where the winners were those who could suffer longest without a sound. From the outside, visitors saw discipline, children who sang hymns with a unity that seemed angelic. From within, every note carried the memory of a reed pressed between teeth. Every pause was measured against the tick of the metronome. Every silent second was a prayer forced from lungs that wanted to scream. The chapel filled with the smell of oil and breath, and the bell remained the final word. It rang whenever panic broke through, and its echo taught the children that mercy was not in release but in how long they could keep themselves from breaking. The attic of St. Mary's was not listed in any ledger, not mentioned in any visitor's tour, and not spoken of by staff who wished to keep their place. The door was narrow, painted the same dull color as the wall, its lock polished by hands that never trembled. Behind it stretched a room lined with slanted beams and a single window that faced the sea. The panes were kept shuttered, but the air always carried the faint sting of salt mixed with a sharper smell, one that clung to the tongue like metal. Inside, shelves were lined with bell jars that caught the lamplight, their glass fogged from within by the ghosts of old breaths. Beside them lay sheets stained in blotches of pale blue, cloths that had been soaked in a chemical wash and left to dry until stiff. When the lantern flame flickered across them, the blotches looked almost like faces pressed from inside the fabric, mouths stretched open and frozen in silence. In the center of the room stood an iron frame. At first glance it looked like the skeleton of a cot, but closer it revealed gears and a crank that hummed when wound. Its surface was stretched with wires that quivered at the faintest touch, carrying a low vibration through the air like a hidden metronome. Matron Lucia Caro and Father Malachi Duval worked here together, their partnership quiet but exact. She brought the children up one by one, hands steady, voice low, guiding them as if this were no different than evening prayer. He set the bell jars in place and dampened the fabric with a chemical wash, then ordered the child to exhale against it until the cloth stiffened in the cold air. They called these offerings breath prints. Each one was unique, the pattern of condensation spreading like veins across the blue. Lucia pressed her hand over the cloth when it was done, whispering that peace had left its mark. Malachi wound the frame until it gave its faint hum, timing how long the exhalation lasted, measuring the weight of silence the child could give before the lung seized. To the child it was another test. Another night where panic was dressed as devotion. To them, the cloth became more than cloth. It became proof, recorded and saved, a trophy of obedience shaped by fear. The attic filled with stacks of these stiffened fabrics, each folded with care, each labeled with chalk marks instead of names. Lucia touched them often, stroking the hardened surface as though it were the cheek of a child sleeping. Visitors never saw this room, never smelled the sharp sting of the wash or heard the hum of the iron frame in the rafters. Downstairs they saw calm children singing in one voice, never knowing that silence had been harvested and pressed into cloth like flowers dried in a book. The attic was the hidden heart of St. Mary's, a place where breath itself was turned into possession, where life was counted not by pulse or laughter, but by how still it could be made and how long it could be preserved. In the evenings, when the chapel lamps dimmed and the metronomes were wound down for the night, the home turned its attention to supper. The kitchen was always warm, steam curling from kettles and a smell of bread rising from the oven, thick enough to make children's mouths water even before the bell rang. Mrs. Bridget O'Rourke presided over it all, her cheeks flushed from heat, her smile wide and honest in a way that fooled every visitor who passed through. She was the one the donors loved, the cook who turned meager ingredients into meals that smelled of care. But beneath her apron pocket, tied in waxed cloth, she carried small glass vials filled with what she called rest drops. Clear, odorless, just bitter enough to hide under sweetness. Each evening she soaked the bread crusts in milk, stirring until they softened, then dripped the liquid from her vials with a steady hand. The crusts were set on each plate, golden edges softened and glistening like treats. The children ate hungrily, never noticing how the sweetness coated the sharpness. Within minutes, the same rhythm began, heads growing heavy, eyelids lowering, small hands slowing on spoons. Bridget hummed as she cleared the bowls, stacking them in neat rows while bodies at the table slumped in the same order night after night. She moved with the quiet satisfaction of a mother who had rocked her brood into calmness, though she knew it was not rocking but chemistry that held their bodies still. Lucia Caro watched this routine with approval. She stepped in once the last bowl was stacked, her voice low and warm as she whispered over the drowsing children that sleep was a kind teacher, that peace came when bodies learned not to resist. She moved among them as they were lifted from the benches and carried to their beds, laying her bare hand against each chest, feeling the slow, shallow rise that pleased her more than any word. Once they were tucked into neat rows, she brought out the weighted shawls. They looked like nothing more than heavy blankets, stitched in quiet patterns, but inside the seams were lines of sand and salt that gave them a pressing weight. She chilled them first on the porch, leaving them under the night air until the cloth turned stiff and cold. Then she laid each one across a narrow chest, smoothing the edges until the child lay beneath it as though pinned in place. The shawls pressed down in a way that forced stillness. Every exhale had to be shallow, every inhale shortened, as if the lungs themselves were being trained to obey. Children learned not to fight against the weight because fighting wasted breath. And the lesson they had been taught again and again was that wasted breath meant failure. Under the shawls, in their drugged half-sleep, they accepted the press as normal, as part of what it meant to be cared for here. Obedience came easily now. The bell no longer needed to ring in the night. The children had already been bent into quietness before their heads touched the pillows. From the outside, the dormitory looked serene. Donors walking through in the mornings remarked how rare it was to see so many children sleeping peacefully, how blessed St. Mary's was to hold such calm. They never smelled the faint bitterness that lingered on the lips, never noticed the stiffness in the arms that did not move even in dreams. For the staff, it became routine, Bridget soaking crusts, Lucia laying shawls, silence falling faster each night. What looked like care was only control layered over drugged sleep, and what looked like devotion was only the steady rhythm of lungs pressed shallow until they forgot how to rise any other way. Outside, the sea wind began to pick up, carrying the promise of snow. Inside, a pattern had taken hold, one that would not break until the storm itself tested it. The shawls were not blankets in any true sense, though they looked harmless when folded on the end of each bed. Their stitching was tight, the seams heavy, and the fabric rough against small hands that tried to pull them close for warmth. Inside the seams ran lines of sand and salt, fine grains sewn in like a second skin. This weight gave the shawls their purpose. They pressed down with the kind of slow force that did not bruise but taught a body how to yield. Matron Lucia Caro said they were a comfort, that the earth itself was heavy and children must learn to mirror it. At dusk, she laid them across each chest with the tenderness of a mother tucking in her young. Her touch was soft, her voice soothing, but the effect was suffocating. The shawls pressed into ribs until lungs could not expand without resistance, until breath itself was measured and shallow. In the winter, the cruelty sharpened. Lucia hung the shawls outside before supper, letting them stiffen in the night air. They grew hard in the cold, almost brittle edges curling like frozen sails. When she laid them across sleeping bodies, the cold seeped deep into skin, making the ribs tighten. As the children warmed the cloth with their breath, the seams softened and drew closer, pulling tighter against the chest. It felt to the children as though the shawls were alive, responding to their lungs, binding them for each breath they dared take too fully. No one cried out. They had learned long ago that sound brought the bell, and the bell was worse than the weight. So they lay silent, their breath shallow, the lesson repeated night after night until it became habit. Thomas Keene, age 9, learned this better than most. He was small for his years, with ribs sharp as fence rails under thin skin. At first he had fought the shawl, his chest heaving, his arms flailing against the pressure. But the bell had rung so quickly, its piercing note followed by the matron's hand pressing down, that he learned the cost. Now he lay almost motionless when the cloth descended. His chest rose only a fraction, just enough to keep life flickering, his eyes wide in the dark until exhaustion pulled them closed. In the silence of the dormitory, lined with beds and identical shawls, Thomas's breathing was almost invisible. To look at him was to wonder if the body beneath the blanket still lived at all. Lucia believed this was progress. She wrote a white circle in her ledger beside his bed that night, proof of his obedience. She told herself the children were being given a gift, hearts that did not race, lungs that did not waste. She told herself they would be closer to God because they had been taught to make themselves small, still, quiet. To any visitor, the room looked like a picture of peace, children resting neatly, not a sound breaking the hush. But beneath the weighted shawls, in the half-dream of drugged sleep and trained silence, small lungs strained against a pressure they could no longer fight, and a boy named Thomas nearly disappeared into the quiet that had been forced upon him. The house did not echo with cries. It echoed only with the sound of nothing, a nothing so deep it seemed chosen when in truth it was learned. Outside, the storm winds scraped harder at the windows, but inside the weight of quiet ruled all. Father Malachi called them lessons, though nothing about them resembled teaching in the way the world outside might understand. In the courtyard, where the snow drifted high against the stone walls, he ordered an iron worker to fashion benches out of black metal. They were narrow and sharp-edged, built not for comfort but for restraint. These benches became known among the children as the snow cradles. Each evening in the deep of winter, Malachi packed their frames with blocks of ice hauled in from the yard. The metal froze until the surface glittered with frost, and when a child was told to lie down upon it, the shock of cold cut through skin straight to the bone. A metronome stood on the altar rail, its brass arm ticking with mechanical certainty. The sound was steady, merciless, demanding. Malachi told the children that their bodies must learn to follow its beat as faithfully as the stars follow the heavens. He pressed reed bits into their mouths, narrow tubes that stung the tongue with bitterness. They were ordered to hum through them, to stretch sound across the ticking seconds. The air that passed through was drawn cold from the night, chilled until it scraped the throat and numbed the lips. Each note faltered more quickly than the last, not from laziness but because the body's need for warmth and breath was being pressed into silence. Thomas Keene learned to obey without complaint. He lay on the snow cradle with his arms stiff at his sides, his chest barely moving under the weight of the shawl, still lingering from earlier. He hummed with the reed, eyes fixed on the flicking brass arm. His body shook, but he forced the hum to hold. The lesson was not only in endurance, but in stillness. No writhing, no gasps, only the slow surrender of life to rhythm. Each time he succeeded, the metronome ticked on, the bell remained quiet, and Lucia's hand rested on his chest with approval. But not every child could meet the count. Elsie Hart, Thomas's closest companion in the dormitory, was smaller still, her breath always thin. She shivered as soon as her back touched the frozen iron. Her lips went pale, the reeds slipping against her teeth as she tried to hum. The metronome ticked without pity. The hum broke. The bell rang once, then again, sharp in the chapel air. Malachi's eyes narrowed, his hand striking the bell each time her sound faltered. The children sat rigid, each bell strike teaching them what failure meant. Elsie tried again, her throat raw, her hum no louder than the rattle of wind through shutters. The bell kept ringing, each note like a nail driven deeper. That night the bell did not stop. It marked her faltering again and again until the sound itself seemed to fill the home. Thomas watched her body sag, her chest struggling under the shawl's remembered weight, her lips numb and blue from the frozen air. The lesson demanded stillness, but what he saw was the quieting of something that should have cried. Malachi called it a test of spirit. Lucia wrote only a smudge in her chalk ledger. The children returned to their beds with the bell still echoing in their ears. In the silence afterward, they understood that no sound was safe. Not a hum, not a gasp, not even the cry of a friend fading beside them. From that night forward, Thomas held his breath longer than any child should, while Elsie's place grew empty, another bed made neat, another circle drawn white in the matron's book. Outside, the snow piled higher against the walls, sealing the home in cold as if the storm itself approved of the lesson. Constable Edwin Pike entered St. Mary's home with boots still carrying the crust of snow from the storm. His face was raw from the wind, his eyes narrowed by the sting of days spent searching drifts for the missing. Beside him walked Clara Whitlow, a young reporter whose notebook trembled in her hand. Not from cold, but from the weight of what she expected to find. The halls were warm, unnervingly so, carrying no trace of the storm that had swallowed the coast. Fires burned steady, the air smelled faintly of bread and soap, and the walls gleamed with a polish that denied any panic had ever crossed them. The beds upstairs remained neatly made, the boots lined in pairs beneath them, each room more orderly than the last. Where chaos should have lingered, there was only stillness. Lucia Caro greeted them with a smile soft enough to disarm suspicion. She moved with calm hands, offering tea poured from a silver pot, her voice even, her eyes full of a practiced grief. She spoke of the storm as though it were an act of God too cruel to name, her tone suggesting she too was only a victim of nature's appetite. Pike watched her with the heavy suspicion of a man who had seen lies dressed in courtesy before, but Clara leaned forward, determined to capture every word, every detail that might explain the vanished 15. It was then that Lucia drew a book from her desk. The ledger lay open on the polished wood, its pages lined with neat white chalk. There were no names, no initials, no words of comfort or memory, only circles, columns, and small crescent moons pressed into the margins. Each mark carried the permanence of ritual, not record. Lucia explained with a gentle smile that it was a system to track chores and prayers, a method of keeping order in a house where chaos might otherwise reign. She traced her finger along the columns, speaking of discipline and gratitude, while Clara's eyes caught on the shapes themselves. 15 perfect circles stood side by side, each one marked on the evening before the storm. Beside them, faint moons glowed pale against the page, as if phases of silence had been charted instead of lives. One circle, though, was wrong. It was smudged, a faint gray streak running out from its edge as though someone had tried to erase it, or as though the chalk had been blurred by a hand unsteady with fear. Clara stared at it too long, her pencil still above her notebook. Pike cleared his throat, asking why no names appeared, but Lucia only repeated her words. Order, discipline, gratitude, like scripture. She closed the book with care, sliding it back across the desk as though nothing more could be seen. The tea grew cold between them, untouched. Clara wrote a single line in her notebook. 15 circles, one smudged. The image stayed with her, heavier than any explanation the matron's warm hands could offer. Outside, the snow had begun to thaw into dirty heaps along the road, but inside the home, the white chalk remained untouched, cleaner than truth. A record of silence rather than children. The smudged circle seemed to whisper that not all silence was chosen, and not all could be erased. Ambrose Vell was a man who drifted from town to town with a cart of tools and a reputation for fixing what others no longer trusted their hands to touch. Clocks, organs, even the rare factory metronome. If it ticked or hummed, Ambrose knew its rhythm. One winter, weeks before the storm, his cart rattled up to the gates of St. Mary's. The matron herself had sent word. Something in the attic had faltered. Some machine that once kept steady time had grown uneven. She greeted him at the gate with her usual calm smile, and though her hands were warm when she pressed coins into his palm, her request was colder. She wanted, she said, a steadier sound, one that children could keep without faltering, one that would not forgive a slip in pace. He followed her up the narrow stairs into the attic where the air smelled sharp, a chemical bite that stuck in the nose. There stood the iron frame, its wires trembling faintly with a dying hum. Gears clicked out of sync, their rhythm stuttering in a way that made the skin crawl. Lucia watched him work, her eyes unblinking as he tightened screws and oiled joints until the machine purred smooth again. The hum grew steady, lower than before, deep enough to sink into the chest. Ambrose, who had spent his life repairing the heartbeat of machines, felt the sound press into his own lungs until he unconsciously slowed his breathing to match. When he looked up, he caught Lucia smiling as if pleased with his surrender. She whispered that children needed something to follow, something stronger than panic, and that now they would not fail. It was then that Ambrose noticed the wall behind the frame. A section of boards had been painted the same color as the rafters, but when he leaned his tool against it, the echo that came back was wrong. Hollow, as though the space beyond had been carved out and sealed. He rapped the boards again, softer this time, and felt the vibration move through the floorboards like a faint ringing. He asked what was kept behind the wall, but Lucia answered with only a calm glance and the words that storage was plentiful in a house this size. He did not press further. There was something in the way her voice curved that told him not to ask again. When his work was finished, the machine sang in its new rhythm, relentless and even, filling the attic with its hum. Ambrose felt it still in his chest as he descended the stairs, each step oddly in time with the beat above. At the gate, he paused. May Brennan, the laundress, stood with a basket of linens in her arms, her eyes downcast as always. Ambrose leaned close and spoke low enough that only she could hear. He told her to keep away from the attic, to never linger where that hum carried. She did not answer, but her grip on the basket tightened until her knuckles turned white. Ambrose left town that evening, his cart rattling back toward the coast road. He never returned, though in later years he would recall that house to anyone who asked about his travels. He remembered the matron's request for a sound no child could escape, and he remembered the hollow wall that rang like a hidden bell when touched. What was kept behind it, he would never know. But he carried the echo with him long after the storm had buried the home in silence. May Brennan waited until the others had gone, her hands raw from work and her eyes darting like a cornered animal. She told Clara Whitlow she would show her something, but only if the constable stayed away. Fear was etched into the laundress's face, a fear that came from years of hearing what others had not. Clara followed her into the laundry, where steam clung to stone and the smell of lye masked a sharper tang. May pulled aside a basket of damp linen and lifted a small hatch at the base of the wall. It looked like nothing more than a chute for clothes, narrow and stained from years of use. But when May slipped inside, lantern trembling in her hand, Clara felt the weight of the house shift. The chute dropped into a shaft, close and airless, its walls slick with old moisture. Clara lowered herself after May, her skirt catching on nails, her breath echoing too loud against the narrow boards. At the bottom was a crawl space that ran toward the chapel. Dust and soot layered the beams, but the path was worn smooth by passage. May pointed ahead toward what looked like an old hymn board leaning forgotten against the wall. Its painted numbers had faded to ghosts, but when she pressed against it, the frame moved on a hinge, revealing a narrow corridor beyond. The walls inside were lined with dark felt, the kind used to deaden sound. Clara stepped forward and felt the air change, thicker, expectant, as if the boards themselves held breath. May touched the wall with the flat of her hand. A thin ringing answered, faint but sharp, as though the wood had been tuned like an instrument. Clara followed, pressing her palm to the boards, and felt it too, the vibration humming through her skin, a secret note buried inside the walls. The corridor ran short but heavy with silence, and at its end lay objects scattered on the floor. Small reed bits, their tips stained a sickly pale blue. Broken bell strings curled like veins across the dust. Clara picked one up, the fiber rough in her fingers, and imagined it pulled tight to ring each time a child faltered. Here was the evidence of a system of fear shaped into ritual. Reeds that stung the tongue, bells that punished panic, walls that hummed with the rhythm of control. May whispered that the ringing had never stopped for her, not even when she covered her ears. She said the house was built to carry it, to make sure silence was not a gift, but a command. Clara saw in May's trembling hands the truth of years spent listening. She held her lantern higher, the flame catching on the felt, the stained reeds, the fragments of bells. The sound seemed to grow around them, not heard but felt, as if the corridor itself wanted to prove it was alive. Clara closed her notebook with shaking fingers. She knew then that the storm had not erased the children, but only revealed what the house had long concealed. Silence had been engineered, timed, and forced, and every breath that broke had been measured against the hum behind these walls. When the thaw came, it did not arrive gently. Snowmelt rushed down from the eaves and pooled in the yard, swallowing paths and sinking fences. By the boiler room wall, where the earth had always been soft, the ground buckled and fell inward, leaving a black hollow that breathed out damp air. At first, townspeople thought it no more than a sinkhole, the sort of collapse common after heavy storms. But when undertaker Samuel Reed lowered himself into the pit with a lantern, the light showed something far too neat for chance. The soil was not raw or broken. It had been cut, squared, and fitted into rows. What lay beneath was not accident. It was design. The space was shallow, not deep enough to stand in without bending, and it carried no smell of rot. Instead, the earth opened into compartments carved like drawers, each one lined with blue cloth that had stiffened with time. The fabric was brittle, its surface salt-burned in white crusts, as if it had once been soaked and pressed flat. Samuel pulled at one corner, and it cracked in his hands like old paper. Inside the compartments were fragments that did not belong to soil, shawls, heavy with salt seams, folded once and then left to decay. Reeds snapped at the tips, their ends faintly discolored as if tongues had pressed them until they broke. And on the wood above each space, faint chalk marks shaped into small moons, circles that had not washed away even under dampness. Samuel called for others to bring ropes, and soon men leaned in with wide eyes, tracing the rows with their lantern beams. The arrangement was unmistakable. 15 compartments, side by side, measured with a precision that echoed the dormitories above. Each one was no wider than a child's bed. Each carried its fragments as if they were relics of the same routine. Cloth pressed against ribs, reeds bitten until they cracked, chalk moons counting silence instead of years. But there were no bodies. The earth held no bones, no remnants of flesh, only the empty echoes of what had once been placed there and then removed. Clara Whitlow stood at the edge of the sinkhole, her notebook trembling as she wrote. She could not help but see the connection. The ledger of white circles, the smudged mark on the page now mirrored here underground in compartments of 15. The blue cloth gleamed faint in the lantern light, a color too deliberate to mistake for chance. She whispered that it was not a grave but a rehearsal, a shadow dormitory meant to hold silence where no voices could rise. Samuel, brushing dirt from his gloves, shook his head and said only that this was not how the earth should be used. As the men covered the pit with planks, the sound of dripping water echoed like a clock running down. The boiler hissed nearby, steady and indifferent, as though nothing unusual had been uncovered. But the ground had given up its secret, and with it the image of a house that had built beds both above and below, each arranged in perfect order, each carrying the same lesson. Silence was not an accident at St. Mary's. It had been carved, counted, and buried in rows, waiting for discovery once the snow gave way. Clara Whitlow's story ran in the county paper on a damp spring morning when the ground was still soft from the thaw. Her words were plain, stripped of flourish, but they carried the weight of what she had seen. The ledger of chalk moons, the corridor that rang when touched, the empty compartments beneath the laundry lined in blue cloth. She described the shawls stitched with salt, the reeds cracked between small teeth, and the bell that punished panic until it replaced every prayer. She did not name blame as much as she named detail, and yet the meaning could not be mistaken. 15 children had vanished in the storm, but silence had been their lesson long before the snow took them. The paper sold out before noon. Farmers carried it folded in their coat pockets. Mothers read it aloud at supper tables, and ministers stumbled over their sermons as the words spread. The town wanted answers, but what they received instead was law. Officials met in the courthouse, their faces grave, their words cautious. A trial would demand names and proofs they feared could not be held in hand. What they could do, however, was pass rules that looked like justice while keeping St. Mary's unspoken. By the end of that week, a county ordinance was written into the record. It required that no death could be marked without 2 witnesses from outside the family present. No child could be buried without signatures to confirm breath had truly ceased. And most pointedly, garments that pressed upon the chest, what the officials called pressure garments, were banned in every children's home across the county. The law did not mention shawls stitched with sand and salt, but those who had seen them understood. Months later, the state followed with its own measure, quieter but wider. They called it the Quiet Room Act. It outlawed private seclusion cells in orphanages and schools. It barred the use of metronomes or mechanical drills as training devices for children. It insisted that any practice of enforced silence be witnessed, logged, and reviewed. To the public, it was progress, a sign that Clara's words had bent something larger than one town. But beneath the applause, people whispered about what had not been said aloud. No trial was held, no charges brought. Lucia Caro and Father Malachi Duval, the 2 most central figures, appeared at the first hearing with calm faces and careful testimony, and then disappeared before the second. Some said they had boarded a train at night, others that they had slipped onto a ship bound east. Their names were left off the rolls, their houses emptied, their traces gone. Clara pressed for answers but found doors closed. Constable Pike told her the county had done what it could. The undertaker refused to speak of the pit again. May Brennan vanished from her position, leaving only damp linens folded on a bench. Clara kept writing, but each line felt thinner against the silence that grew around the home. Still the laws carried forward, and though they never spoke the names of St. Mary's, every reader who had held her paper that first day understood what had driven them. The county wanted no more vanished children, no more chalk moons, no more beds underground. History would remember the ordinances as reforms, but Clara would remember the faces never shown, the smudge in the ledger, the hollow echo of the walls. Laws had been written in response to silence, but the silence itself had slipped away with the matron and the chaplain. They had left no trace but the rules that came after them, rules meant to bind others from repeating what they had perfected in secret. And yet the memory of the storm and the absence of 15 voices lingered heavier than any statute could erase. Years passed, and the sharpness of that winter storm dulled in memory. The roads were cleared, new children's homes opened elsewhere, and St. Mary's itself was left to sag into disrepair. The windows grew blind with dust, shutters came loose in the wind, and weeds crept high against the stone walls where once children had lined up for hymn practice. Yet people did not forget entirely. They passed by the grounds and lowered their voices, some crossing themselves, others muttering that the sea air was colder near that place, as if the house itself exhaled differently from the rest of town. By the boiler room wall, where the ground had collapsed years before, a memorial was set, not by the county, not by officials, but by townspeople who could not bear the emptiness. 15 stones were laid in a row, unmarked by name, cut plain and gray, each etched with only a single date, the night of the storm. The stones carried no faces, no initials, no way for a passerby to know who had been lost, but those who remembered said that was fitting. The home had erased names long before the storm had done its work. Children were kept as marks, circles of chalk, moons in ledgers that measured obedience instead of life. The stones were meant to mirror that, to hold silence honestly. No claim of identity, no promise of story, only the cold permanence of loss set into the earth. Visitors came now and then, some kneeling, some only standing long enough to count the row with their eyes. Others stayed away, unsettled by the thought that each stone marked not a child's rest but a system's success. That silence had been arranged so neatly it survived into stone. Clara Whitlow aged, her hair streaked with gray before she could admit it. She carried with her the smudged ledger page that Lucia Caro had once shown her, the page she had copied in ink and photographed in her memory. She kept it folded in a cloth inside her desk drawer, and whenever new laws were passed, whenever another orphanage was inspected or another reform claimed victory, she unfolded it again. 15 circles, one smudged. To her it was not just evidence but confession. The mark of a hand that faltered, a truth that tried to break free from the neatness imposed around it. She showed it once to a group of students, her voice tight as she explained that history sometimes left its greatest wounds in symbols, not in words. The room had been silent afterward. Not with fear, but with the discomfort of realizing silence could be forced and passed off as peace. When she returned to the grounds with a camera crew years later, weeds rising to her knees and the stones worn pale from storms, she spoke not with anger but with the steady cadence of someone who had waited too long for answers that never came. She touched the stones one by one, then turned to face the lens. Her voice did not tremble. She said that evil here had not shouted, had not raged or struck in chaos. It had arranged, it had timed, it had called itself care, and because it looked like care, people accepted it. Visitors praised the discipline, donors gave coins for the quiet, and neighbors believed peace lived behind those walls. But peace had been only breath forced shallow, lungs pressed until sound was punished, children trained to vanish themselves before the storm ever arrived. The camera lingered on her as the sea wind moved her hair and the stones stood mute in their row. Clara asked the final question, her eyes not on the crew but on the viewer she knew would one day watch. She asked how we recognize cruelty when it comes dressed as kindness, when it smiles in smooth sheets, when it holds a child's shoulder with warm hands. She asked what silence we accept because it looks orderly, and what harm we excuse because it is tidy. Then she asked the question that had kept her writing, the one she could never answer herself. What do you think? Could this happen again? The wind whistled through the broken shutters of St. Mary's behind her, carrying no voices now, only the thin sound of air through hollow wood. The camera did not look away from the stones, and for a moment it seemed as though they answered her in their own way. Not with names, not with comfort, but with the same silence that had always been mistaken for peace.